Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our Zero Net Energy Virtual Summit. My name is Jesse Marcus. I'm the Director of Residential and Commercial Business Development at the Propane Education and Research Council, or PERC for short. I'm really excited about today's event and hope you all find value in attending, but we also hope that you as California propane marketers will help guide our understanding of how we can best support your efforts with construction pros and consumers as it pertains specifically to Zero Net Energy and propane's integration. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few housekeeping notes that I wanted to go through. The webinar will be recorded, so we'll send a recorded version to all attendees shortly after we conclude today. We'll also post the recorded version of the webinar to our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/buildwithpropane, and we'll send that link. We'd like this virtual summit to be engaging and discussion-oriented, so to that end, everyone on the line does have speaking abilities, but with great power does come great responsibility. So we ask if you're not contributing or talking to please mute your line. If someone has left their line unmuted and we're getting some ambient noise and feedback, we will mute it for you. But you can also ask questions through the question box that you all have access to. So we'll be monitoring those as we go through the presentations. And lastly, because our webinar has a lot of time dedicated to presentations, I'd love to follow up with the propane marketers in attendance to further discuss challenges, barriers, opportunities, strategy, and then going back to, again, how PERC can best support you all in your efforts. So let's now shift to our presenters. We have three, and we're very happy they could be here with us today. Our first presenter is going to be Joy Alafia. I think a lot of you are familiar with Joy. She is the president and CEO of the Western Propane Gas Association, or WPGA for short. WPGA values propane as part of California's clean energy economy. Under her direction, the association is leading the way for the commercialization of renewable propane. That was kind of a mouthful to say. Joy's presentation will cover California's timeline for achieving net energy policy goals, other policy and legislative trends, and WPGA's strategic plan to ensure propane's continued prosperity for building energy use. Our second presenter is David Knight. David founded the Monterey Energy Group, or MEG, in 1983. Since then, MEG has become California's leading mechanical engineering firm, specializing in residential HVAC, energy compliance, solar, and plumbing design. In a typical year, MEG will consult on around 800 California projects from Orange County through Napa. This presentation will explore propane's past, present, and future place in the California State Energy Code. And finally, Chris McAllister will round up the presentation. Chris has been with the Harris Poll for 20 years, working with clients on corporate reputation, brand, issue positioning, strategic communications research, and Newsmaker Research Commission for public release. Chris will discuss findings from a ZNE-specific survey pertaining to multiple decision-maker audiences commissioned by PERC. So we have a packed agenda, hoping for discussion. Again, please mute your lines if you are not speaking. And I'm going to now pass the mic over to Joy Alafia. Joy.
Thank you, Jesse. Let me take you off speaker here. Thank you, Jesse, and everyone for taking time out of your morning. Very excited to present with you to you today. And I'd also like to add one other housekeeping tip for those who may have to step away from the phone. Please do not place us on hold. Some of you have some lovely hold music, but we don't want to hear it. So if you have to place us on hold, it's better to just hang up and dial back in. So thank you for indulging me on that. And as Jesse indicated, I'm going to cover Zero Net Energy and what's happening in California. Next slide. So for those who somehow have not heard already, Zero Net Energy is essentially applies to all building codes for residential and commercial buildings. And it essentially targets buildings to produce as much energy as they consume so that the net energy impact for a building structure is zero. And so how does a structure produce energy? It does so through solar panels and potentially some other propane generated opportunities as well. Next slide. Here's the timeline that we are in the state of California. So we first started hearing about zero net energy in 2015, and that was phase one, where some of the principles were adopted. Phase two allowed for a voluntary compliance and still working through some of the regulatory changes as it relates to the regulation. And then phase three is really when the new legislation and regulation codes take effect. So you can see for new buildings, all new buildings, residential buildings built in the year 2020 are to be zero net energy buildings. And for commercial, it's the year for new commercial builds, the year is 2030 for compliance. The California Energy Commission is also targeting all existing homes. So for existing homes, they're looking for a 17% improvement in energy efficiency or compliance with zero net energy regulation by the year 2020, and by 2030, a 34% improvement. So how, you might ask, do you upgrade existing homes? Well, this will come into play when someone's looking to maybe add on or do some construction modifications to their homes. The new building codes will include zero net energy regulation. Next slide. 2 ways to adhere to the regulation. There's a prescriptive path, and that involves pretty much a model of how best to adhere to zero net energy. So it tells you, you know, use this type of water heater, this type of insulation. It's very easy to follow, if you will. And then a performance path gives you a little bit more flexibility. You just have to make sure your structure meets the performance obligation. So you might indulge on something that consumes a little bit more energy in one type of way, perhaps an appliance, but then you're going to make up for that with high efficient windows, for example. Next slide. So for the propane industry, we're looking at opportunities for tankless water heaters, generators, heaters, and dryers, as well as stoves. Next slide. And I wanted to share a little bit about what's been happening in California for the association, and specifically what our involvement has been with regulators and legislators. So first, the California Energy Commission identified some forecasting for propane that really didn't reflect the true marketplace of our industry. So for example, they didn't understand the seasonal pricing associated with propane, where it's more expensive in the winter typically and less expensive in the summer. There were some issues with how they identified where the propane was coming from, and essentially using models that didn't really make the most sense for propane in California. So we were able to work with them. They were using at some EIA data versus using data from PAD 5, so not collecting the best data as it relates to California. So we were able to work with them, and although it still is not optimal, the numbers that they came up with, at least their forecast is a little bit more grounded with our input. Next slide. And so we're also working to demonstrate propane's value to regulators. They certainly embrace tankless water heaters. That was something that wasn't even a hard sell. They get it. And working really to share some of the other opportunities that we have. And there's something called the time-dependent value. That's not to get into too much detail, but that's where I was sharing. We helped with the forecasting. So the next slide, you could see if you go to some of the pricing that they've identified for propane as they forecast out through 2040. And this gets updated every year, and this is the dollar per gallon. So you could see by 2030, and this was as of 2016, their forecast was for 2030, a residential price point for propane was going to be around $3.21. And if you jump to 2019, their projection their 2030 projection is $3.76 per gallon. Next slide. So moving on, there is also a new solar mandate, if you will, that came into play this year, and it basically requires that all homes built 2020 or beyond have solar panels, assuming that there's enough sun. If so, there are some exemptions, but energy officials estimate that this provision will cost about $10,000, so adding to the cost of a single-family home. But they were able to pitch this idea from the idea that the homeowners will be able to recoup some of that cost over time with energy savings. So if you stay in that home, I guess ideally you'll be able to recoup some of that cost by their forecasts of energy saved by generating solar power. And this is no surprise. If you look at the regulation, they need to have solar power and battery opportunities. Next slide. So some detail here about solar power homes. The mandate only applies to all houses, condos, and apartment buildings 3 stories up to 3 stories tall that obtain building permits after the 1st of January 2020. It's an opportunity to increase battery storage and solar, as the slide shows. And the real focus of this is to offset electricity that's generated from natural gas. So that's really the focus, and I'd just like to make that point clear. Next slide. So there are some exemptions, as I mentioned, for shaded homes or obviously homes with small rooftops. So if you don't have a big enough footprint, you probably doesn't make sense to install solar. Builders will be getting compliance credits as it relates to those calculations for installing batteries, think Tesla Powerwall. And the state officials are looking at this technology improving over time, and they're expecting some opportunities for electric water heaters in the future as well. Next slide. Next slide, there we go. So changing gears, that was the Energy Commission. Now when you look at the legislature, I just want to share a couple of things. We had a bill last session to make all homes electric ready, defeated that bill. There was a bill to mandate rooftop solar. It's kind of been accomplished anyway, but that bill was failed in the legislature. And there was a bill that initially proposed to ban fossil gas. They were really focused on natural gas, but propane was scooped into that as well. And that was reduced to a study with the involvement of the association members and propane customers. Next slide. Bill that passed that really embraces opportunity for propane is funding support for near zero emission building technology. So that's a great opportunity for our industry. Next slide. So what are the next steps from the association standpoint? I think we're going to cover quite a few of those and maybe get some more today, but here's a few. Next slide. PERC has already started the step of educating builders with the Propane Training Academy, and you can see the website there. This is really a great opportunity to provide an overview of residential zero net energy homes, giving builders and designers a sense of key opportunities to include propane, efficiency propane in their building, in their build. Next slide. Oh, and I should add that on the last slide, they also get continuing education credits. So it's not just a class for fluff. There's actually some credit opportunities there. Next, we as an association are looking, as it relates to the fires, to partner with local communities and energy agencies for funding opportunities to make sure they build smart, energy efficient homes. So this is an example of one such opportunity for MCE that provides $4,900 for those rebuilding after the wildfire. And we're looking to do something similar for this. In this case, if your home is 20% above the energy code, a home owner has the opportunity, or builder, to get $4,900 in credits. Next slide. Obviously, we also need our equipment manufacturers to keep up with the regulation. So improving energy efficiency is very important. Looking at microgrid technology. So what are the opportunities where you could have direct use propane generation for electricity and potentially, or even other uses, and potentially even netting electricity back to the grid from that direct use, much more efficient than transmitting electricity from a power plant across transmission lines for hundreds of miles. And then another unique opportunity, solar power backup options. So using propane power generators. There's a few opportunities for propane generators, not just the solar power option, but also in California, unfortunately, wildfires are the new norm, mega wildfires. So we're going to see a lot more blackouts associated with the utilities turning off electricity to avoid high risk for fires. And in those instances, those are opportunities for propane generators so that customers continue to have power when there's a high risk of fire. Next slide. And certainly renewable propane has a role to play. So next slide shows you can make renewable propane from a variety of ways, from beef fat, and that's currently taking place by a group, Renewable Energy Group out of Geismar, Louisiana. Next slide shows you can produce it from vegetable oil, and that's what's occurring currently out of Neste Oil in Rotterdam and their commercial volume production of renewable propane. Next slide. You can also produce renewable propane from dairy digesters, so capturing the methane from the cows. You can produce, actually it's not renewable propane, you can produce dimethyl ether or DME. And we're exploring blending that with, I hear Cindy laughing, hopefully there's something funny in the office. You could blend that with propane. And in this instance, you're actually capturing carbon from the atmosphere. So think of it as a carbon sink. And when you look at carbon intensity values, we're looking at potentially very low carbon intensity values because it's actually a negative carbon value for DME as a carbon sink. Now, when you blend that with propane, we're talking about carbon intensity values in the teens or lower. Next slide. And we also need to build our brand. Unfortunately, people either don't know about propane, they think of barbecues, or they might just associate us with a fossil fuel. So we really need to do a better job of educating both the public and the legislature on the value of propane, with an emphasis on clean energy and renewable propane, talking about total life cycle emissions, and empowering members to share this message as well with their touches with the public and legislators. Next slide. And I'd just like to point out, we talked a little bit about wildfires, the importance of propane in this context. So the wildfires have pretty much eliminated all of the greenhouse gas gains associated with all of the regulation every year. Wildfires are the single highest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in our state. And this slide was actually done in 2017, and we've had more fires since then. So you can see the chart that shows how much black carbon comes from which source. And you can see on-road vehicles in green is just 6%. And when you look at that the largest slice of that pie associated with wildfires, it's 66% of the black carbon. And that's more potent than CO2. So my last slide really just hits home, hopefully, and we can communicate this to legislators and the public. And if you go to the next slide, it's simply stating that we need all ultra-low carbon solutions to address and mitigate the emissions associated with wildfires. So thank you for the time, and I can pause now for questions. Okay, I'm not sure if their phones are muted, and you might have been all good stewards, but this is actually an open conversation. And if you like, we could roll through to the next one and then maybe do our questions at the end. All right, why don't we do that?
Thank you, Joy.
Turn it over. Thank you.
That sounds perfect. Thank you, Joy. And to echo Joy's point, this is an open conversation, open discussion. Jeff Stewart did enter a question into our question box. Jeff, if you don't mind, we can kind of go to that question at the end when we have some other questions that we'd like to pose to this group too, because I think it fits really nicely into that section. So if there are no questions for Joy specifically in her presentation, I think what we'll do now is we'll pass it over to David Knight, who is the founder of the Monterey Energy Group. David?
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Knight. I work for a small, humble mechanical engineering company called the Monterey Energy Group. We're located in Carmel, California, and I have an office up in Santa Cruz, and I have an associate down in Los Angeles that handles our Southern California meetings. We're just your basic mechanical engineering company. We focus on residential projects. We work full-time for about 250 architectural firms. A third of our work is Orange County through Santa Barbara. Another third is kind of the greater Monterey Bay Area, and the other third is from like Los Gatos through Napa. We look at somewhere close to 1,000 residential jobs a year, consulting on energy compliance issues, HVAC design, solar design, that sort of thing. Okay, next slide. So I just want to give just a super brief history of the State Energy Code. It was actually started in a very small way back in 1978, back when Jerry Brown was governor for the first time and he was dating rock and rollers like Linda Ronstadt. It was a completely different time. And the reason for the Energy Code was really quite simple. They were building a nuclear power plant in San Luis Obispo called Diablo Canyon. All the, counterculture people were freaking out about what all was going to happen. And the justification for building, more electric capacity was, because we needed it for space heating and domestic hot water in homes and things like that. So when the Energy Code started in 1983, its main focus was to eliminate using electric resistant space heating and domestic hot water, which when you think about it is a great thing for propane. Because there's nothing cheaper than electric water heaters or electric baseboard space heating. And the Energy Code, again, starting in 1983, for the most part, completely eliminated that as an option. And so, so at least, starting then, it's actually been, I would say, a pretty positive thing for propane. But we'll get more to the story. Oh, next slide, please. So the best way to think of the Energy Code is it's like miles per gallon for buildings. And in the residential code, it's miles per gallon for homes. As Joy said, there's two different pathways to gain compliance, but 99.9% of the time, we use a performance approach. And the performance approach is basically, like I say, it's trying to figure out, how the kind of the overall efficiency for the building. So things like insulation levels, glass area, glass orientation, glass performance, overhangs, HVAC efficiency, domestic hot water efficiency, and any solar, capacity is used in a state certified program that spits out a budget. And so basically what the Energy Code is saying is you can build your house any way you want. You can heat it with anything you want, as long as it gets 100 miles a gallon. And in 2020, basically 12 months from now, the code gets twice as hard. So your new home will have to get 200 miles a gallon. And so it's tough to meet, but there's a lot of flexibility. And so, one of the things about the Energy Code, it doesn't look at appliances or lighting in the residential code. It mainly looks at space heating, space cooling, and domestic hot water. It doesn't look at anything outside the building. It's only things inside the building. Okay, next slide, please. So the thing about the Energy Code is it impacts, a few 100,000 jobs a year in California. It's any new residential project. It's any addition to an existing residential project. It's any alteration to a residential project. People changing out their windows or, changing out their, HVAC system or domestic hot water. you know, adding on, gutting a house, whatever, the energy code kicks in. It doesn't, for existing homes, it doesn't kick in the full way, just partially. But it does, you know, it does require some attention. The good news of the energy code is as it sits right now, it absolutely does not, you know, require any sort of retrofitting to existing homes. You know, so for example, if you're you know, remodeling the house and changing out the windows, you know, your windows are going to be impacted, but the rest of the house would not be. And so the existing market for propane for domestic hot water and space heating, and you know, and cooking and that sort of thing, stays pretty much exactly as it is. But if you're, you know, like I say, the code kicks in when you're doing something a little bit more significant. Okay, next slide, please. So the energy code is amazingly complicated in California, and part of that complication is they split the state up into 16 climate zones, which is kind of a, you know, that wasn't a bad thing to do, because, you know, as you're sitting there trying to meet a 100-mile gallon budget, well, your requirements in Palm Springs should be a whole lot different than they are in Humboldt, or, you know, the same thing for, say, Lake Tahoe through San Diego. So they split the climate zones, you know, into 16. And so basically, the way the budget's determined is it's what climate zone you're in and how big the home is. Like I say, it's 99% performance-based. There's almost zero projects that ever meet the prescriptive requirements. What's funny about that is that if you go to any training in the energy code, it's fairly easy to describe the prescriptive requirements, you know, do these 10 items and you're good to go. The problem is the 10 items are just undoable. Whereas the performance approach, which is maybe 50 items, but you have all these trade-offs, you can almost always meet the budget. At any rate, long story short, it's all performance-based, but if you talk to any building official or other sources, they tend to talk about the prescriptive things. Anyway, key takeaway: the code starting in a year is going to be 50% harder than it is now. The other thing about the energy code is, for the most part, it wasn't really enforced until 2014. I'm banging out 1,000 compliance jobs a year from 1983 till 2013, and for the most part, you know, the building departments would collect the reports, thank you very much, you get a permit, and that would be it. Starting in 14 is when they've brought in third-party inspectors, and the building departments have really focused on this issue. So it's become something that is no longer, it's just become something that has to be taken more seriously. The result of the energy code, because it's required significantly more insulation, much better windows, and much more efficient HVAC and domestic hot water, is less propane sold per home. It's been pretty effective at that. And it could be natural gas, or it could be electricity if the home was heated with heat pumps. But the goal is to just keep reducing the amount of energy used for those things. Now, the zero net energy requirements kick in 2020. But the way the CEC defined the zero net energy is, for the most part, the thought was, I mean, you know, this has been going, they've actually come up with this idea about 12 years ago. And at the time, it was just as Joy described. Hey, you keep track of how much energy the home, or you somehow predict how much energy the home is going to use, and you have to produce that amount of energy with grid, you know, some sort of grid-tied solar electric system. Well, what happened first is that mainly the builders said, hey, look, our clients want to cook with gas. You know, they don't want to cook with electricity. And so the CEC acquiesced and said, okay, fine. And then people with half a brain looked up and said, look, there's not a decent way to provide domestic hot water using electricity efficiently. And so they said, okay, well, we'll certainly let you use, you know, natural gas or propane for domestic hot water. And then they said, well, look, if we got natural gas for domestic hot water and for cooking, we might as well do space heating as well. Heat pumps are they're more expensive for space heating, and in harsher climates, they're not very efficient. So the way the new zero net energy requirements is basically it's looking at lights and appliances and a little bit of air conditioning. So the good news is, post 2020, really the difference for propane, there's really not that much difference for propane that I can see. And other than that, the amount of, you know, because they're going to require more insulation, you know, wrapping the buildings with foam or triple glazed windows, things like that, it will certainly reduce how much energy is needed to heat homes. But in my, I think again, propane survives, lives. It just goes on almost like nothing happened. The other thing about the Energy Code is the State Energy Code, the California Energy Commission. They're very conflicted when it comes to solar electric. The California Energy Commission is a conservation group. They're not, by any stretch of the imagination, an organization, at least the part that oversees the Energy Code. They're not people who look at renewables as anything but a way to, somehow reduce the amount of insulation that they want people to use. And their goal is homes are super insulated cocoons, and if there's a little bit of solar contribution, whatever. But the Energy Code does not, there's not a way to say put in a whole lot of solar electric and that offsets less insulation or less or allows you to put in a lot more windows or single pane windows or that sort of thing. So they're a little bit conflicted, and trust me, I've banged my head against this for 10 years. The clients we work for, they want, for the most part, nice, big, beautiful homes with lots of glass, and we're just the engineering company to, to help work on that. But the Energy Commission looks at it differently. So they're not huge proponents of solar electric. For the first time in the Energy Code, we actually will be getting some compliance credit for solar electric with storage, which is great because there's actually a pretty good compelling story to that. Okay, next slide, please. So as I see it, propane's competition are heat pumps, both air to heat pump water heaters and heat pumps for space heating. And the good news is, for the most part, the grid in California is expensive, and using heat pumps compared to propane. I mean, we're asked, probably 100 times a month, hey, is it more cost-effective to go propane and propane furnaces and propane water heaters, or to go heat pump and this and that? And the answer is almost in all parts of California every time. It's more cost-effective to put in propane for space heating and domestic hot water. Operating costs are less, and I would argue the features are significantly better. And that's against the grid, and but it's somewhat complicated because you take air to air heat pumps for space heating. The efficiency of those units really depends on the climate. I mean, they're terribly inefficient in mountain areas or when it gets much colder, but they're pretty darn efficient in places like San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles, that sort of thing. It's much harder for propane to compete against heat pumps in areas like that. But again, in the mountainous areas, it's not even close. The other side of it is that the cost of electricity varies amazingly in California. I'm up here in PG&E territory where we have upper tier electric rates, 46 cents a kilowatt hour. To do space heating paying 46 cents a kilowatt hour, it's just, I mean, it's not even close to being cost effective against propane. But there's other areas, LADWP, which is a mild climate and has fairly reasonable electric rates, something 12 to 18 cents, depending on the time of year and the time of day. So it just kind of depends, and so it's a little bit complicated. It's not always the case propane is more cost effective, but it's usually the case in California. Okay, next slide. As a rule of thumb, I just basically would say that anytime propane is $3 a gallon or less, it will be, more efficient, more cost effective than a heat pump where they're paying something in the 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour, and then the COP is coefficient performance, and that varies greatly by where you are. If you're in San Diego, your coefficient performance, which is basically the efficiency compared to electric resistance, is maybe 4. But if you're in anywhere in the mountain areas, your COP is maybe 2. So like I say, it's a little bit complicated, but for the most part, propane does quite well in those areas. Okay, next slide. So some of you may be aware there's another type of heat pump called a geoexchange or ground source heat pump. And these units, these units, this is where you basically put a bunch of coils in the ground, and you take advantage of the fact that the Earth is a pretty constant temperature. Whereas air source heat pumps, the efficiency plummets the colder it gets outside. With ground source heat pumps or geo-exchange heat pumps, it stays the same. So they're significantly more efficient than air source heat pumps. And so in areas where it gets really cold, Colorado, Canada, some places in the upper Midwest and Northeast, geo-exchange heat pumps actually can make some sense. In California, where most of the state is fairly mild, the difference in efficiency between a ground source heat pump and an air source heat pump isn't that great. Plus, keep in mind that in California, we have, for the most part, high electric rates. So there's very little market for geo-exchange heat pumps outside of Lake Tahoe. And in Lake Tahoe, it's kind of a miserable market too, just because of the rocky soil. It makes it really, really expensive to try to do geo. To compound the problem, since there isn't really a natural market for geo-exchange heat pumps, we don't really have many contractors that are familiar with the systems. They're inherently expensive and inherently complicated. So there's almost no competition for propane when it comes to geo-exchange heat pumps. There was at a time when the Energy Code actually did give compliance credit for geo-exchange heat pumps, but that's pretty much, they felt it's just kind of too complicated. So they dropped that. Okay, next slide. So here's just your standard energy compliance form. And this is a standard house, climate zone 3, which is kind of coastal central California. This uses a ductless heat pump, and it's got a lot of insulation and really good windows and yada yada. With a ductless heat pump, you run the numbers and basically have to meet a certain budget. In this case, we are minus 4.8, meaning we don't comply. You got to be a positive number. We keep the exact same house. If we go to the next slide, please. Everything is exactly the same, and the only thing we changed is we went from using an air source heat pump to a propane furnace, and our compliance margin jumps all the way to plus 16.8%. So I talked about the kind of the brief history of the Energy Code. Here's where we are right now. Propane actually has a huge compliance advantage to ductless air source heat pumps. Weirdly, the way the Energy Commission works is, where the Energy Code works is the compliance credit you get for ducted heat pumps is actually better than you get for ductless. It's just part of the state being the state, and so the numbers aren't quite as different here. But in general, the way the Energy Code works now, they would much rather have you put in a propane furnace. Yeah, like I say, they'd much rather have you put in a propane furnace than put in an air source heat pump. And that's true pretty much throughout California. Okay, next slide. Oh, go ahead, keep it there for a second. Go ahead and go back. The one thing about this is, the heat pump, the heat pump lobby, companies like Mitsubishi, Samsung, LG, Fujitsu, Daikin, there's very, very large global industrial companies. They didn't really taking this lying down, so trust me, they're at the Energy Commission every day trying to get their products rated better than they are now. But as it sits right now, they're not treated that well by the Energy Commission, and I would argue part of that's probably just the actual efficiency of the units. Part of that is California's electric rates, and part of that is that just there's this inherent, within the Energy Commission in that bureaucracy, there's just a kind of a natural tendency not to like all electric systems or any sort of electric system. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned earlier that, look, I work for a mechanical engineering company, and one of the things we never want to happen is people call us and saying we're out of domestic hot water. It's basically three things for us. We want them to be warm on cold days, cool on hot days, and never to run out of domestic hot water. The devices that are efficient enough, and remember, I said electric resistance domestic hot water heating was the first thing that got eliminated back in the early 80s. So there is a lot of promotions now for something called a heat pump water heater, which are electric water heaters with they're slightly more efficient than electric resistance, but they're terrible units. They're noisy. They put out a ton of cool air. They don't last very long. They dribble out the warm water, and we beg our clients not to use them. The only time we ever see them used is on some multifamily jobs where they just, the cost of running gas or propane is high, and it's multifamily where they're just going to rent out the units and they don't seem to care much how much hot water is provided. These units are temperamental. Very few plumbers know how to fix them, and GE took a stab at this. I think the unit was called the Geo Springs. They just gave up trying to make them because of how much they're just not very good units. There are devices called heat pump water heaters where you actually have a compressor that sits outside rather than the compressor that sits on top of a storage tank. Those are a little bit better, but they also cost $4,000 or $5,000. We're not, in the tankless water heaters, trust me, we've probably talked more Californians out of using them than anyone, but they've gotten a lot better in the last 15 years, and now we're very comfortable with some of the brands, and if you put in the right number of them, you can definitely get plenty of domestic hot water with proper maintenance. They can be reliable. Any rate, but I think there's just almost no question that propane's a significant better choice, propane water heating, than electric. Okay, next slide. Okay, so quick takeaways. The 2020 Zero Net Energy Code does not prohibit propane or natural gas for use for domestic hot water or space heating. I would argue far from it. It's pretty much, they would consider that going to be the norm. It will, however, rather dramatically reduce the amount of, energy needed for space heating, space cooling, and domestic hot water is not really impacted that much either. However, as an engineering company, we see kind of the other shoe falling, and that is, next slide, please, is for the most part, it's easy for propane furnaces and water heaters to compete against grid-powered, air source heat pumps for space heating and domestic hot water. It's become very hard to compete against solar-provided electricity. What's happened in the solar business has just been incredible. Similar to calculators and computers and cell phones and a lot of electronic things, the price of solar panels has just dropped amazingly so. In the last 10 years, I've seen it go from $4 a watt to 40 cents a watt. I remember, people putting in for kind of remote cabins in the early 2000s, people spending $8 a watt per panel. And again, we see routinely the cost at 40 cents or less. And the other thing too, the thing about these solar electric panels is, they were made to get shut off in space. They come with a 25-year warranty. There's not a lot of required maintenance. And so, and cheap solar electric is one of the reasons heat pumps are gaining popularity, because it's become that expensive, that cost effective. Again, the Energy Commission looks at solar electric. I would argue the Energy Commission looks at solar electric as competition to hyper conservation. And if you look at the cost effectiveness of adding solar, we usually see for new homes about a 5-year payback, 20% return on investment. What the Energy Commission would rather have you do, and this is why they don't give you compliance credit for putting in a large solar electric system, the Energy Commission would rather have you triple glaze windows with a 100-year payback, add a couple inches of foam to the outside of your walls, 200-year payback. They'd rather have you do a lot of things that are just not very cost effective as opposed to putting in solar. To me, it's silly. But it's just kind of the way the bureaucracy works. Now, next slide, please. Now, obviously the problem with solar is, it only produces power usually between 10 and 4. And even then if it's cloudy, it doesn't produce anything. In fact, but what's interesting is California is now overproducing. There's been so much rooftop and solar farms built in California. We're actually overproducing electricity between 12 noon and 4 p.m. We're getting to sell the electricity to other states, and we're overproducing. And so that's what's opened up the market to battery storage on both sides of the meter, on the utility side of the meter as well as on the consumer side of the meter. And one of the things that's happening is the way solar is about to work is everyone's about to go on what's called a time of use meter, where between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the afternoon or in the early evening, there's going to be a surcharge for any electricity that's used, whether that's for domestic hot water, for space heating, lights, appliances, you name it, air conditioning. And so that's what's opening up the market for batteries. And as you can imagine, it's going to be a big market. And you have, Tesla Powerwall, you've got LG Chem, you've got, 50 other companies that are looking at trying to provide battery systems for this market. And most of our new homes that we work on, the consumer is choosing to put in a large solar system with batteries. And I got to tell you, it can be very cost effective. It still struggles to be cost effective with domestic hot water and space heating. But because people don't have the option to use anything but electricity for lights and appliances and air conditioning and swimming pool filter pumps and that sort of thing. They obviously have an option to do domestic hot water and space heating. So that's where it gets close. But for the other things, solar compared to the grid, it's not even close. Solar is way less expensive than most of California's grid every time. Our favorite client is not a rich hippie trying to impress his neighbors by having the maid drive a Prius. My favorite client is a super conservative accountant who carefully compares the cost of grid-provided electricity to solar-provided electricity. Solar wins in most parts of California, and it wins easily. And so I think that's where the competition for propane in the future is, can it get cheap enough to affect the domestic hot water and space heating and space heating? And we'll see. It's going to be close. Anyway, so and the other side of it is, the electric utilities in California. Oh, sorry, next slide. The electric utilities in California are just getting beat up, from all sides. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is actually from Bruce Springsteen's home in Malibu. And this is the contractor is on the beach, his fans in the water. He's taking a look at that picture of I forget what they called the fire in Malibu this year. But utilities are getting it from forest fires. They're getting it from cheap solar from solar farms as well as rooftops. They've got to protect the grid from terrorists who are plotting. It's like the holy grail of terrorists is going after our electric grid. I mean, they got more problems than almost anyone. And but at the same time, they're a utility, and they're guaranteed a certain amount of profit. And so, and pretty much no matter what, even though they've lost a huge percentage of their income from cheap solar, and LED lights, cut the lighting usage in half or more, and all the things that have reduced the demand for electricity. You've got solar, producing electricity. It's just been a nightmare for the utilities. So, but again, they're guaranteed their income. Next slide, please. So the way they're getting their income, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but it keeps happening, so it's hard to ignore, is if you're the utility and you're asked to provide a new service for a home, the utility used to give you a really good deal to bring gas, if the gas was available, or electricity to your site, because they knew you were going to be a good, loyal customer for the next 30 to 50 years. Now when the utility brings service to your site, they're fully expecting you to produce your own electricity, and therefore, they're not going to get any income. So what does a smart utility do? They charge you up front for the 30 years of electricity that you aren't going to buy. So the hookup fees have just gone up dramatically. I mean, what used to cost a few thousand, we've seen people spend $20, $30, $50,000 to have, electric service brought up, a few hundred feet. It's just been amazing to see what's happened. Same thing with gas. And so many of our clients are choosing to, next slide, please. Many of our clients are choosing to, if not choosing to, then seriously considering just going off grid. And I think this is going to be a really nice opportunity for propane in California, because, next slide, please. So when you think about it, homes are already incredibly efficient. LED lights, Energy Star appliances, super insulation, unbelievably good windows, nice efficient HVAC. The homes are already dramatically reduced how much energy they use. You throw in how inexpensive solar's become with a certain amount of batteries, and most importantly, a good propane backup generator. All the things you see on this screen, they're already going into most every new home. There's really not a lot of extra cost. And a lot of people put in backup generators anyway. And so for a few dollars more, and in this case, if you imagine taking, some of the money that you would have, spent to have your hookup, either a new hookup or even just slightly adjusted hookup from the utilities, you can be off-grid pretty darn fast with every creature comfort that you would have, being completely independent of the grid. Has a lot of appeal for a lot of Californians. Almost any, go ahead, next slide, please. Almost any solar contractor will tell you the first words out of a prospective client's mouth are, "I want to be off-grid." Either they're mad at the utility, or they just feel that's the closer to God or whatever. Anyway, but my thought is, and again, we're seeing more of this, is you combine a nice, efficient, propane furnace, propane water heater, obviously the propane tank itself, and a backup generator with all that's going into a home anyway. I think it's going to be a pretty successful, repeatable business going forward. And I just think from the consumers we talk to, I think that's something that would be a fairly easy sell at some point in the next few years. Okay, next slide, please. So we're just starting to see this trend, but if the cost of batteries continues to drop and the hookup fees continue to increase, I think it could be a nice market for propane suppliers, and even in areas where natural gas is available, because the cost of new electrical hookups is, for example, I can't speak to like Southern California gas, but I know in PG&E and San Diego Gas and Electric, when utilities are doing both, the hookup fees have gone up dramatically in both. Okay, that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much. The name of my company is called Monterey Energy Group, and if you have any questions, write them down, or if you want to shout them out or take them at the end, it's up to you all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask David directly? Okay. If you need some more time to think some questions up, we will certainly have more time at the end. Did someone just jump in? All right. So our next presenter is Chris McAllister. He is with the Harris Poll. What Chris is going to do is go over the Zero Net Energy Home Survey that we commissioned with the Harris Poll recently. So without further ado, Chris, if you'd like to take over.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So just to provide everyone a quick background on who we spoke with. So this was an opinion survey. It was conducted online. There were 4 primary target audiences that we interviewed. For all of these audiences, we surveyed a representative national sample. So these are not respondents who live in a propane zip code necessarily, or just in the state of California, but they are across all of the country. So we interviewed 1,000 current residential home buyers. So these are people who expect to buy a new home as their primary residence in the next 2 years. Residential home builders. These are people who expect to build a new home as their primary residence in the next 2 years. Remodelers. So they just had to say they were going to remodel 1 or more rooms in a current home within the next 2 years. And we also interviewed professional home builders or remodelers. So these are representatives, professionals who basically build homes or remodel rooms in existing homes. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to share with you some of the findings, not everything, but at the key findings of the study are that, you know, sort of indicative of the two prior presentations. There's a high degree of people wanting to consider energy efficient home, and in particular, energy efficient appliances. So those are becoming very appealing and are very appealing for people, the four audiences that we interviewed. So we asked about green energy efficiency in homes and appliances, but then we also went into some detail on the concept of zero net energy. And so unaided, awareness of what zero net energy is fairly low. It's a little bit higher among the residential home builders, and for the professional home builders, only about half indicate they were very or somewhat familiar with the concept of a zero net energy home. When we gave them a description of what it means to be zero net energy, and I think Joy used a variation of it earlier, favorability is very high, as is consideration for purchasing a zero net energy home, building a zero net energy home, and also the willingness to pay more to achieve zero net energy status. So with that, though, there are concerns that about whether or not you actually will recover the additional outlay up front over time to pay for zero net energy. So whether or not it's going to pay for itself or not, that remains there remains some confusion about that. Okay, next slide. So the survey started just sort of as a warm up for folks about energy efficient appliances, and so just about half or more of all four of the audiences are very likely to purchase an energy efficient appliance if they needed to. Just about everyone is at least somewhat likely to do so. So those types of appliances are obviously, there's a lot of traction with those and people are interested in them. Next slide. When we took a step back further, before we introduced the concept of zero net energy homes, we wanted to sort of get a sense of more general their likelihood to buy a green home. And a green home being a home that uses energy efficient materials in its construction and its use. And so here, likelihood is as well very high, with nearly half of the two residential home buyer or builder segments. Remodelers, that question was posed in terms of their remodel, and for remodelers, the energy efficiency of the room is important, but a little bit less important. And you can see that in the difference in the very likely, which went from around 4 and 10 to about 3 and 10. Okay, next slide. Energy efficiency itself is very important. You can see that here. It's again, it's a little more important for the home builder or home buyer in the residential sense. And when you ask them why is it important, not surprisingly, cost savings and believing that they are better for the environment are the two themes that really dominate, first and foremost led by the expectation that there are going to be cost savings with energy efficiency. The one difference here again with the remodelers is that they are clearly more focused on potential cost savings than the environment. There still are concerns about the environment, but relative to the home buyer or home builder, cost savings are much more important. Okay, let's move on. There is a willingness to pay more for a home or a remodeling project that they believe will be energy efficient. Now, it is notable that for the most part, they're only somewhat willing to pay more, but it's still a large majority indicates some willingness to pay more to make sure that their home or their remodeling project is energy efficient. So as a follow-up to that, if they said they were willing, we asked them in percentage terms, how much more do you think you'd be willing to pay? And so what you see here is that in terms of their stated willingness, sort of the sweet spot for most was around 20 to 29%. But the mean and median is around 30, 20%, give or take. There's among the home builders, the residential home builders, there's a sizable 31% who said that they'd be willing to pay 50% more. Now, this is stated willingness to pay more. So in these types of surveys, it can be difficult to get an accurate assessment of how much more they actually would be willing to pay. But we do see relative consistency here across all three of the segments in terms of what they'd be willing to pay more to achieve energy efficiency status. Okay, let's move on. Among the professional home builders, energy efficiency is a topic that comes up almost all the time. So it's either their clients are asking them about it for their opinions. So for 87% of the professional home builders say that it's either always or sometimes brought up by clients. But as well, 9 in 10 say that they're proactively talking to their clients about what are some of the construction methods that they could do that would make the home more energy efficient. So it's coming sort of from both ways, and it's definitely a hot topic of conversation among the home builders, professional home builders. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so we asked a two-faced question about where they think, how far they think the demand for green, sustainable, or energy efficient homes has come over the last few years and where they expect it to go in the future. And so what you can see here is that over the last couple of years, there's a strong consensus, both looking back and looking forward by around 9 in 10 professional home builders, that number one, the demand has increased over the last couple of years, and that demand is expected to grow even more. For us, what we think is most significant is that the percentage of those who say that it's increased significantly over the past couple of years, really jumps tremendously when they look ahead. So looking ahead, 2/3 of professional home builders expect that the demand for green, sustainable, or energy efficient homes is significantly going to increase. So from what we've heard today on all three of these presentations is that that's certainly the direction where they think that the home builders think it's going. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so what we're looking at now is the unaided familiarity with just the term zero net energy homes. And so what you see is that for the three residential audiences, those who say that they're either very or somewhat familiar with the concept of a zero net energy home is pretty weak, particularly among home buyers and remodelers. It's around 2 in 10. The residential home builders, they're a little more educated about it, so it jumps to around 4 in 10, and it's up to 5 in 10 for the professional home builders. When we look at specifically at propane users and their familiarity with zero net energy, 31% of the residential home buyers who are currently a propane user indicate that they're familiar with zero net energy, which is a little bit higher than the 23% of all residential home buyers. it's about the same for the residential remodeler who's also a propane user. Okay, next slide. So before we provided them with an aided description of what it is to be zero net energy, we provided them a list of adjectives and said, pick the 3 that you think comes close to representing what you think it means to be zero net energy. And across all 4 of the audiences, the 2 that emerge is energy efficient and environmentally friendly. So with the residential home builder, they are, again, they're a little more educated, more familiar with this, and so green and smart comes into play more so with them than with the other audiences. But it's really across all the residential and the professional, energy efficient and environmentally friendly are the things that emerge. Okay, so here's the aided description that we used of a zero net energy home. It just basically says that they have to produce as much as it uses, it's connected to the grid, and still needs a source to power the home when the solar panels do not generate electricity. When we provided this aided description, it's about half of all 3 residential audience say that they've heard of this, and it's 8 and 10 of the professional home builder. So it's higher on an aided basis, but it's still fairly low for the residential audiences. Okay, next slide. So after giving them that definition of what it is to be a zero net energy home, we asked them to provide their level of favorability with it. And so you can see it's almost unanimous for all 4 of the audiences who are at least somewhat favorable toward the idea of a zero net energy home. Most are either in that middle 2, just favorable or somewhat favorable. You got about 1/3 of the residential audiences and close to half of the professional home builders who are very favorable toward it. Okay, let's move on. And then for those 2 residential audiences that are in the market to buy a home or build a home, we asked them their likelihood to consider buying or building a zero net energy home. And what you see here is that the likelihood is pretty strong. After you give them a definition of what it is to be zero net energy, there's clearly a level of interest in it. Okay, next slide. So similar to the green or energy efficient home, we asked them to their willingness to pay more to achieve zero net energy status. You'll see we also have the professional home builders here as well. And for them, we asked if they thought their clients would be willing to pay more. So what we do see, which I think is encouraging, is that across the 2 residential audiences in comparison with the professional home builders, they do seem to be in relative sync. So the percentages of how willing they think they'd be to pay more is very consistent, which is encouraging. If they were divergent, that would be more of a problem. And then similar to the earlier question, where about how much more they'd be willing to pay for energy efficient or green, sustainable. It's pretty similar in terms of the to meet a zero net energy status. The sweet spot for Z&E is somewhere between 10 to 29% more willingness to pay more, and the residential home builder, the one who's going to be paying for it to be built, there's a little bit more interest to pay more. It's 30% say that they'll be willing to pay more than 50% more to meet the Z&E status. Again, in a survey like this, it can be difficult to get a real sense of actual willingness to pay, but this is stated willingness to pay more. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So when we asked all 4 of the audiences, what would they consider to be the ideal energy source for a Z&E home? So the 3 that lead are electricity, geothermal, and natural gas. And you can see PERC there is a little bit ahead of heating oil, but trailing the other three by a relatively large margin there. Okay. So the energy source that professional home builders say their clients most often request for their in-home appliances, it's basically either electricity or natural gas, and you see propane there at 5%. And so as we look at these slides, and again, it's important to keep in mind that this was a national sample, and so the percentage of actual propane users in the sample was fairly low. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. In terms of what the professional home builder is likely to recommend for those in terms of building to Z&E standard, again, it's the same three. So solar at half, natural gas and electricity are tied at 40%, propane's at 6%. You do see that those who have, of the professional home builders who have experience, who say they have experience building a Z&E home, propane actually, there is a difference there, 13% who would say propane versus the 2% who do not have experience building a Z&E home. In terms of why they would use propane, it's clean, easy to use and obtain, cost efficient and easy installation. So it's easier for them. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and so this is the last slide of this presentation. So again, we asked the professional home builders where they think that the demand has come over the last couple of years and where they think it's going for Z&E homes. So here there is a bit of a difference. So over the last couple of years, they say that demand for Z&E is 66% say it's increased, but only 15% say it's increased significantly. But over the next 5 to 20 years, they really do expect to see that it's going to grow significantly. And in particular, again, just looking at those who say it's going to increase significantly, that's up 153% relative to when the professional home builders look over the last couple of years. So that is really an indication of, the seriousness with which they think that this is going to change for the professional home builder. So I think that's the end of the presentation. Yep. So Jesse, do you want to take back control, see if there's any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciate you going through all that. So that ends the presentation portion of the virtual summit. So now with the time remaining, what we wanted to do, if there's interest in participation, is ask a few questions. So maybe we can start with the attendees. Are there any additional questions for the presenters or for me coming from the PERC perspective?
This is Jeff Stewart. I had typed a question in. It's unclear to me if other attendees have seen that or if I should restate.
Jeff, why don't you go ahead and restate, please?
All right. A couple of the presentations, I think it was Joy's specifically, there was minimal mention of combined heat and power units that really appeared to me to be the key factor for the propane industry to be able to contribute and to try to offset the dramatic gallon reduction that we're going to see with Z&E. There are no products available really that would have any application in the state of California. That would meet this application in the state of California, primarily due to ARB approval process and extraordinary cost, and in the eyes of pretty much all manufacturers a lack of demand or market. That's a big gulf that we have to cross as an industry. If we are, certainly it's nice to have Renai, tankless water heaters that are part of the solution. Some of the other heat pump applications that Renai has, but they're not going to be generating the electricity portion and the distributed generation, goal really of CNE. So, question is how to cross that. And specifically, my question is, and it's more to PERC. This is a nice program that PERC has on the autogas side of things to incentivize manufacturers to seek EPA certification. Is there a similar program that could be developed? I know it's not in place right now, to be able to incentivize manufacturers to engage in that approval process so that we have products to bring to market.
And Jeff, to answer your question from PERC, you're correct. There's not a program in place now, but of course, with kind of industry demand, especially from leaders like you, it's certainly something that we can look further into and start planning for. My question to you, and maybe to the larger group as well, is you mentioned that there wasn't much of a market for the CHP. Are you getting interest from manufacturer partners like Yanmar or Marathon or whoever the CHP manufacturers would be that are pushing this type of want or need to get into the California market?
No, it's more us going to them to encourage them to engage, and their unwillingness to do so.
And part of that unwillingness comes in the form of the cost or the high cost of these types of certifications. Correct. Okay.
Yeah, they don't want to, they don't see the market opportunity, and they don't, frankly, want to engage with ARB. So we need to try to figure out how to change that. And I think that it comes down to having a significant push in communication, education of them to demonstrate how this, particularly with a renewable component, how this can be part of the solution.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. I do appreciate that. And like I said, kind of in the beginning of in the presentation, what I'd like to do is follow up with every marketer that is on the line individually. And Jeff, I think this is something that I remember you mentioning, kind of certification, funding back at the April Southeast meeting when we met with some manufacturers there. So this isn't new, I suppose, for PERC, but I think maybe in our next conversations we can kind of filter out some sort of plan going forward to attract that manufacturer audience and CHPs in general. Are there any more kind of questions for the presenters or any additional thoughts or feedback from the group based on the presentations, or maybe just anything that you're seeing kind of in the field or with your Construction Pro partners or your customers?
Hey, Jesse.
Before we jump on that, I'm sorry, this is Joy. I just wanted to share, I was muted before. So with regards to the slides that I presented, I did mention, and I didn't say CCHP, but I had microgrid technologies and netting electricity back to the grid. So that certainly is an important opportunity, and I'd love to follow that thread with PERC. I think just outlined some good opportunities. So sorry, I'm kind of late squeezing that comment in, but muted and then self-muted somehow. So apologies for that, and Apologies to whomever I just cut off. One other thing that may be of value, though, if we could just announce who's on the line so that participants know if you think there's value there. Just, I don't know if you're able to do a quick run through the names.
Simon would have that information, but I'm not sure Simon knows what organization everybody is with. Simon, do you have that information? Would you be willing to say who is on the line?
Yes, we have Brent Winget from Central Coast Propane. We have James Lyons from Newport Partners, but he's muted. We have Jeff, we just heard from Blue Star. We have Jeff Van Groningen from VM Propane. Josh Simpson from Camps Propane. Julie Johnson from Ted Johnson Propane. We have Kevin Morgan on from Renai, but he's muted. Mark Lightman from Blue Star. And we also have a couple of staff. Scott Graham from Expo Propane, self-muted, and Shannon McWhorter from Sequoia Gas.
Thank you.
We have two questions from Josh Simpson. I think this was during the survey portion. What is the distinction between residential and professional home builders on those slides? And also, what is the typical storage capacity of a residential battery array? How many hours of standby time would that system supply to the home?
Thanks, Simon. Chris, do you want to handle the first question that Josh had? And then David, I think you might be the man for the second question.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, Josh is asking what the distinction is between residential and professional home builders in the segment.
Yeah, a residential home builder is someone from the general public who plans to build a new home in the next 2 years. And the professional is someone who does that for a living. So that's their job. So they are a professional home builder remodeler, and they get paid for it, versus the residential is someone who's going to be paying for a new home that is a new construction.
Thank you, Chris. And then Simon, would you repeat Josh's second question? And David, I was hoping that you might have some insight into this as well.
Yeah, Josh is asking in his second question, what is the typical storage capacity of a residential battery array? How many hours of standby time would that system supply to the home?
Sure. It's like everything else. It's not, it varies. Most consumers choose to just have certain circuits. So let's say there's a power out. Well, it's two parts. The first part is we size the battery storage to ensure that the house that all the electrical demands for the house between this 4 to 8 new surcharge that is coming for all California consumers, that the electric rates basically double between 4 and 8, and you're added there's going to be a surcharge for that. So the batteries are sized based on the amount of appliances and what's going to be required either for space heating, space cooling, that sort of thing. So the batteries are sized for that. The second the second part of the value proposition for batteries is, okay, let's say there is a power outage, and then what's typically done is there's certain key circuits that will be run off the batteries. Your refrigerator, maybe a few lights, kind of a few key things as typically, your big screen TV, wine cellar, the things you just can't live without. I mean, but the rest of it is usually not your swimming pool filter pumps, maybe your, and so that. So, and then, and again, it depends again further. If it's cloudy weather, then the amount of life or amount of energy you get out of your batteries is greatly reduced because the solar's not kicking in. But if it's sunny, then again, depends on what circuits are going. So it's a hard question to answer, but I hope that helped. It's just kind of all over the map. I did want to comment on the combined heat and power. We're an engineering company that does a lot of hydronic heating over the years. And we've worked with fuel cell companies, we've worked with Yanmar on projects, and you know, it's the problem with combined heat and power is, you know, a lot of the efficiency is from producing a lot of warm water. And the problem is, you know, there's only just, it's most of the warm water that's produced is really not usable unless you have a large pool that you don't want to cover, you know. And so it's just, I mean, even if you have hydronic heating, even in the dead of winter, it's hard to get rid of all the warm water that's produced. And in the summertime, it's impossible. So it's, I think that the thought of going from, you know, from photovoltaic cells to batteries with a propane generator, I think is going to be a bigger market than combined heat and power, at least for the residential world, but I could certainly be wrong.
Great, thank you, David. Well, any other questions that anyone might have?
This is Shannon McWhorter. In regards to, you know, all the solar electricity that's being produced today, and there's an excess and it's being shipped out of the state at this point. In the future, what's the possibility of electricity rates coming down substantially because of this excess electricity that we're providing out there?
This is David Knight again. I'll try to answer that. I think that it's the whole future of the solar, whether solar or wind, is tied to batteries, so that it becomes a much more complete energy source. And you know, I read reports all the time. You know, if you compare, you know, solar or wind plus batteries compared to, you know, new natural gas peaker plants or coal plants or nuclear plants, that sort of thing, you know, they compare the numbers, then it's, you know, solar is getting more and more competitive all the time. You know, the way it works now is that if you've got solar, your rates are really, really good. And if you don't, they've had to increase you know, if you don't have solar for whatever reason, you know, those rates keep going up to make up for the fact that you know, a lot of the consumers do have solar and the utilities have to make a certain amount of profit. So I think the best we can hope for is a stabilization of electric rates based on, you know, solar getting less and less expensive. Solar now is really quite affordable, and again, but you know, it keeps getting to be a better story. The batteries is the wild card. I mean, they've gotten better in the last 10 years, but you know, there hasn't been the just incredible technical breakthrough like we've seen with solar electric.
Thank you.
This is Jeff Stewart. Again, I had, it's unclear. I'll preface what I'm about to say. It's more a statement than a question. Mark Lightman was at a dairy efficiency conference last week. This is more along the lines of anti-fossil fuel sentiment. There were presentations being made by Southern California Edison, PG&E, and another company, I believe it was called SunPower. And there was a slide that was put up in talking about sort of energy audits and looking for solutions for dairies to be more efficient in their operations, and particularly going toward solar and utilization of electricity in dairies. They indicated that at the first of the year that there were a set of what they called resources. Oh, great. Thank you for the slide being put up on the webinar. You can see here that starting January 1, distributed generation technologies using essentially any fossil fuel, specifically calling out propane in CHP, one of the areas, frankly, where CHP in a dairy application can be successful for sterilization and other uses of hot water, that they're being eliminated from consideration starting January 1 during demand response events. I'm not entirely sure what this means. We're going to do some research on it, but just another example of something that we're being specifically targeted, and calling out that resources using renewable fuels, you can add renewable propane to the third bullet point down there, will be exempt from the list of prohibited resources. So just another sort of data point for people here on the call that I thought would be worth sharing some of the things that we're dealing with.
I just have a question for David on this slide. David, do you know what that term means? Demand response events. Have you heard that term before?
The only thing I could think of is it has to do with, you know, the grid being taxed or overtaxed on a super hot day and that sort of thing. That's usually what it means, you know, but, you know, I'm not exactly sure in this case. Like I say, we mainly do residential work, so it's a little bit out of my space.
Again, this is Jeff Stewart, and I'm going to sign off here in a moment. I want to state that I appreciate this effort to have this discussion. It's very important. There are some important action items from my perspective that have come out of this, and that we'll circle back with Joy on. But there's it is critical that we as an industry engage, as I've said before, in a very proactive manner in education of builders and of alternatives, and that propane can be part of the solution to the Title 24 analysis. And I think we saw some good examples of that today. And it's also critically important on a national level that we identify and encourage manufacturers with products that can be part of the solution. So appreciate the effort being put forward in this area.
Thank you, Jeff. We appreciate it. So maybe shifting a little bit from, if others don't have questions for the presenters, or the presenters don't have any questions for the attendees, I wanted to talk a little bit about how PERC can better support the marketers in California as it's specifically related to outreach efforts. So what we're thinking about doing, or what we will be doing, what we have been doing, is really an education process. As you've seen through the Harris Poll survey, we're kind of lacking in some of that general awareness. And then kind of to Jeff's point too, and something I've been harping on, is that we are a viable solution. And David Knight kind of mentioned during his presentation why that is, and in what appliance areas we can truly make a difference to meet kind of these stricter regulations. So in thinking about kind of your market and thinking about your construction professionals and even consumers in your area, what are some things that we can do? Is it, and what I have listed here is not an exhaustive list, but is it kind of more educational events? Is it more educational resources? And that can go along with kind of the course work that we've already completed, fact sheets, brochures, those types of things, videos, more content, just blasting that in social media and on our websites, et cetera, and just really kind of direct marketing to kind of influencers and decision makers in kind of California and across the country. So that's kind of my open-ended question. That's really what I've wanted to get from some of you, and that's again why we sent some of those resources to you guys in advance of this webinar and this virtual summit. So I'll stop talking there, but if there's anything that you guys can think of, please let me know now or when we follow up and have our different discussion or alternate discussion.
This is Julie. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Julie.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't on mute. I recently read an article from the Woolsey Fire area where Malibu had taken Southern California Edison to task at the local level and said, you're shutting off our electricity, it's unreliable, we just had these fires, what are you going to do for us? How are you going to help us? And, it was really interesting that they were so up in arms over it. And I would love to respond to them somehow with some of these solutions and the upside of propane, especially in their area, and especially that electricity is so unreliable in Los Angeles, especially the west side. I just don't know really how to go about it, but I think it's a great opportunity, especially in these fire-torn areas where they're going to rebuild, and maybe that propane is a solution, especially with the off-grid mentality.
And so are you thinking about this more of like a thought leadership push, maybe from, I don't know, the Tucker, for example, or are you thinking it's kind of more of a direct push from propane marketers where we're giving these organizations resources and educational content that points to how we are a solution?
Well, I could reach out to them and say, hey, would you be interested in a presentation from our association with some solutions here? I guess you never know unless you try. So how can we
Sure.
try?
Joy, do you have any thoughts about that? Just kind of being in California and having experience, I suppose, working with kind of regulatory arms?
There is a big opportunity right now, and I haven't quite got my hands around the approach for it, but I think it's twofold. We're still seen as a fossil fuel, so how do we point out the advantages that David pretty much provided in terms of cost effectiveness and really the most viable solution, and still supporting even solar off-grid or even on-grid with solar opportunities and backup generation. So making sure that we're branded as part of clean energy and not fossil is going to be an important message to communicate in those instances. So I think PERC has worked on a one sheet for zero net energy. I think that can help, and I think it's a two-pronged approach both with the consumer as well. But I think the other component is, as we're looking at rebuilding efforts, making sure that we have some presence in terms of funding opportunities and working with the local cities or whoever's managing the rebuilding efforts, so that propane is already included as a smart solution as you look to rebuild in those affected areas. I don't have all the answers, those are just thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was thinking about kind of when you were talking, how do we show that we are a viable solution, and it's something that we do kind of regularly that we think has a good impact is sort of case study and testimonial. So hearing from your peers, even someone like David, for example, it's not us or the propane industry kind of touting the benefits of propane appliances fitting ZNE portfolios, but really it's about those that are in the field that are seeing these different types of benefits. And even in David's presentation, looking at the portion where the propane furnace was compared to the electrical unit and seeing the difference that propane furnace makes. I mean, I think that's really powerful stuff to see, especially from, a compliance perspective. So in just kind of brainstorming and thinking, I think those are the types of things that would help our case, real life examples of how propane is contributing.
So with the Harris poll, nothing was ever mentioned, or in all the data, nothing was mentioned or said how California is anti-fossil fuel. And I don't know if that's a drum that we beat with our elected officials, and maybe we need to take our hands away from that drum and just go down our own lane and go forward and ignore it. I mean, not that it's not there, but why do we keep propagating?
We can't ignore it. Yeah,
I'm not trying to ignore it, but I can't control it, so I have to let it be.
Right, and so I did speak a little bit of that tone. I think Jeff brought that in too when I shared about the legislative trends that we're seeing, right? So we talked about the fossil ban, and I know even in some counties they're looking at, when they're looking to rebuild post-fire, they're looking at eliminating gas for rebuild efforts after the fire. So this is a very real challenge that does need to be addressed, and it comes with education. And I think there's a smart way to position propane as a complement. I mean, it gets down to, again, when you look at, and I've said this before at district meetings, we don't have the luxury to choose a technology that can't deliver, especially with the black carbon emissions from the wildfires. So we need to be able to present ourselves as low carbon today, even lower carbon in the future, just as even electricity is going to be lower carbon in the future, and how we fit in this puzzle to really make an impact is just high level how I see that, but that needs to be communicated again to the builders and the legislators as we keep seeing these bans, whether it's transportation or home energy on gas.
This is
a disconnect. Yeah, sorry, Josh. I was just going to finish. There's a disconnect between where electricity is, how it's produced, and the reality of it.
Yeah, so, and I'm wondering if we have an open channel to, I guess it would be the county and state officials who are dealing with the aftermath of the Woolsey and campfires, to make sure that we're learning what they're experiencing or did experience with respect to the tanks that were in those affected areas, and what was the experience for the residents and the firefighters who were in those areas, because I think that part of the conversation we've got to be prepared to talk to people about as we're advancing the cause of our position within the construction of off-grid and ZNE homes, is making sure that we're not simultaneously disregarding what has happened as a result of fires like this.
Josh, were you in, or your service areas, were you in the paths of any of the more recent fires? And have you, if so, do you have any insight into kind of the question that you posed?
No, I don't, and I'd like to know more about maybe what we've heard from people who were in those areas. I'm fortunate to say that I don't have any of that direct experience.
Absolutely.
I have feedback, but maybe if Richard Martinelli is still on, if he's not muted, he can share because he was actually in the field for the campfire. And if he's Richard, are you muted or are you not muted, and are you still on the line?
Richard is on the line, and I don't show that he's muted.
He may have stepped away. So I'll just share the feedback that I get both from the fires in Northern California and Southern California. There's some opportunities in terms of our coordination, but as it relates to propane, our marketers were out there as quickly as we were able. There were no issues, at least reported to me, from any of the fires since I've been here in 2014. Of injury or additional damage related to propane tanks. That might be Richard.
Hello.
Hey, Richard. It sounds like you get all the feedback on your.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. Can you still hear me? Hello.
Go ahead, Richard. We can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you, Richard.
Richard, we could hear you before. Are you still talking? Well, I guess to Josh's point, I was just trying to raise, as it relates to reaching out to county officials, we do have a message that we could share in terms of our responsiveness and safety, if that's where you were headed, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make sure that I think that if I were going to describe a scenario that would sound helpful to me, it would be that PERC would be developing the materials kind of on the high level. We would translate them through the lens of California's marketplace, but also make sure that they reflect whatever information we had gained from the experience over the last couple of years, because I think we absolutely want to promote our solutions, but we also have to make sure that we've got a very sincere and clear message with respect to safety, not only in terms of what we believe, but also what people have recently experienced.
And I also think there's an important message with the rolling blackouts of maintaining your energy source. I mean, if you think about people who have medical needs that require energy, the risk of having your energy shut off or your electricity shut off, there's a real safety component there for the consumer that we should highlight as well.
I agree.
Absolutely. Yeah, kind of like a reliability and almost resiliency message, which we do often use. And Josh, to your point, I think the sincere message is really important just in the wake of all the different occurrences. And that's something that we've been trying to kind of be very sensitive to as well, especially, also I'm thinking about kind of hurricanes and how we position propane. And it's not almost taking advantage, but it's a solution. So I think that's something that's really important. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I would also say that the new iteration of the website to me is a great resource and will be a great resource for this kind of effort, because it's going to do a great job of giving us a place to point people towards to find information that we think is accurate and up to date.
And so everybody knows Josh is on that project team. So was that a pat on the back?
That was that's a whatever. That's a high five.
Well, you guys have done a great job in that. And to your point, I hope that is the case. It looks really, really nice.
Yeah.
Hi, this is David Knight again. I gotta drop off. Thanks for having me. I would like to say that if it was me, as an engineering, as I operate this engineering company, what propane means to us is freedom, is The fact that people who are, you know, the opportunity is as people disconnect from the grid for various reasons, and I would say economic reasons, environmental reasons, being, you know, independent reasons, for very, very many reasons. Propane is what allows that to happen. I mean, cheap solar, cheap batteries, cheap LED lights, cheap Energy Star appliances, very, very efficient buildings all help. But without propane to be there to be the backup for the electricity when it's cloudy, et cetera, and without propane being there for domestic hot water and space heating, it doesn't work. But that combination and partnering with the renewable side and the LED light side and the efficient appliance side, to me, is very powerful. And, you know, we don't sell anything. We don't work for any governments. All we do is talk to real people building real houses. And I can tell you that that resonates. And given the fact that the competition, the grid, has become incredibly expensive to connect to, and not just expensive, but kind of inept in how long it takes, you know, to get direct answers from the utilities, to me is a real opportunity. We have a project out in the Carmel Valley, it's a beautiful vineyard, winery, new house, this and that. And PG&E told them, well, they could maybe in a year and a half, they could tell them how much it's going to cost to bring power up to the site. I mean, the grid competition is, I mean, they're good competition for you all because they're so lame. And I just think that that's an opportunity, and it's a very, very positive message to architects and builders and, you know, and all that, you know, without any loss of creature comforts and probably for not much more money, you can have a truly independent source. And I just think that will resonate. At any rate, again, thanks for having me. I got to roll. Good luck to everyone, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
I shouldn't have left David off the phone so quickly because we had a really good discussion just preparing for the webinar. And now so I'll just share some of the notes that I had, and maybe it'll spark some thoughts here. But one of the things that we talked about is targeting the public, architects, builders, and contractors. And David shared the contractors are getting killed by PG&E, at least PG&E delays, waiting months for orders to be filled or to get answers. So, you know, we have some opportunities there just in terms of customer service issues. And let's see, some of the things you already know, just electric water heaters are louder. You don't get as much hot water. And I'm just looking through here, sorry. Space limitations for solar, and it costs $7,000 to $10,000 to install solar per every 1,000 square foot of a home. And basically, his thought was focusing on microgrid opportunities. So, and he shared that in the webinar. So, for what that's worth. It would be interesting if we could have some type of kind of chart, infographic, whatever, that shows for solar supplemented with propane, how many, you know, greenhouse gas emission reductions or cars off the road if there were X amount of solar complemented with propane homes, off-grid homes that were introduced, and what that would mean in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Joy, how can we outreach to contractors? I know, like, we do the farm show in Tulare to outreach to farmers. Is there a way we can get to contractors in one big group?
There's one thing I've learned as an association for everything. So I would start with whatever the Association of Contractors
is that something as the Western Propane Gas Association we should develop a plan to target?
Sure, and I would even pull in PERC in that. So they have kind of the lingo, if you will, and I think we could work together. And so my takeaway in speaking with David is, again, reaching out not just to contractors, architects, builders, and the public, particularly those who are rebuilding. So I took that as an action item for the associations to work on. I think Shannon touched on kind of and David too, kind of a bigger issue. As more and more folks go off the grid, we're going to see more and more potential challenges from the public utility. And we're kind of, it's a David and Goliath mismatch. So I think we need to, I again, don't have the answers, but I think that's something that we need to be mindful. And I'm not sure what's motivating the slide that we have on the screen, if it's still there. I moved away from the slide that Jeff Stewart provided from Southern California Edison. And what I looked up very quickly on demand response events, it's very curious to me. These are opportunities to be off grid, and they're specifically targeting fossil fuels as it relates to not being part of the sandbox of the utilities, and trying to make it harder to leave that sandbox. And they're using the crutch of fossil fuels, and I think we have to articulate that even propane, fossil propane, direct use, and this is something that we can work with the Gas Technology Institute, direct use of propane, even with our truck distribution, assuming this is true, so we need to look at the data, it has a lower carbon footprint than California electricity that's generated at some plant and then transported along lines for hundreds of miles. So we still need to make the case even for fossil fuel and its direct use energy efficiencies.
Going back to Julie's earlier question, the National Association of Home Builders annual convention is in February in Las Vegas, and that's where I think PERC puts some of their resources. I don't know if there's a similar event in California, because the show that's in Las Vegas, which is attended by some people who I know every year, is I think where they all go.
Josh, so there is a National Association of Contractors and Builders. So we have that group too. There's lots of groups, so that it's not hard to find those associations and get on the phone. And PERC, you've done a good job already with the CE credit that you're offering. So you're already reaching out to the builders there.
Yeah, and we are members of the National Association of Home Builders, and I'm sure they could offer us some kind of state-specific information about California and kind of who their members are in your state that we can connect to. We're also members of the National Association of the Remodeling Industry and our AIA, which is for architects. And so we do have those connections. We just would need to dive a little bit deeper in them.
Jesse, could you find out if they offer, they usually solicit speakers, maybe to get Tucker in on that for these shows?
Yeah, for IBS, that would be, are you talking about the International Builder Show in particular?
Any of them, or whichever one we're already involved in to take it to the next level, not just being an exhibitor, but, a speaker.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have 2 minutes left. Joy, did you have any additional questions, or did anyone want to bring anything else up in the time that we have remaining?
Nothing for me, thanks.
Okay. Well, again, we certainly appreciate everybody joining. I really appreciate the discussion and the feedback. Please do not hesitate to contact me. If you would like, it's Jesse, Jesse, Marcus, Marcus, at propane.com. And I will be in touch with you all soon to follow up and maybe even strategize even further and get some more insight and perspective from you all. But thank you to Joy, thank you to David, who's not on the line anymore, and thank you to Chris. Thank you to Simon for managing the webinar, and thank you all for attending. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and a good weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.